picture this. You are crouched behind a marble column in the Vatican's most sacred halls, the air thick with incense and something far more intoxicating. The year is 1501 AD, and through the shadows cast by flickering candelabras, you witness what no eyes should ever see within these holy walls. The sound of silk rustling against stone mingles with laughter that echoes through corridors where saints once walked. Your heart pounds against your ribs as you realize you are about to witness the most scandalous evening in papal history, an orgy so depraved that it would make even the Romans of antiquity blush with shame. The October air carries the scent of roasted chestnuts through the Vatican apartments. But tonight, these humble nuts will become props in a performance that will forever stain the reputation of the Catholic Church. In the private chambers of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, 50 courtesans prepare for an evening that will be recorded in the most secretive diary of Renaissance Rome, preserved in the Vatican archives for centuries like a forbidden confession hidden beneath layers of pious prayers. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The man who would become known as the most perverted pope in history was born Rodrigo de Borja y Doms on January 1st, 1431 AD, in the Spanish town of Xàtiva near Valencia. The dust of Spanish roads clung to his childhood memories, but destiny would carry him far from those humble beginnings to the marble corridors of Vatican power. His uncle, Alfonso de Borja, had already begun climbing the ecclesiastical ladder, and when Alfonso became Pope Calixtus III in 1455 AD, young Rodrigo's fate was sealed like wax on a papal bull. At 25, Rodrigo was made a cardinal deacon, not through divine calling or spiritual devotion, but through the ancient art of nepotism that flowed through the church's veins like poison through a dying body. The young Spaniard arrived in Rome with hunger in his eyes and ambition burning in his chest, ready to devour whatever opportunities the eternal city might offer. Rome in the late 15th century was a city of contradictions that would have made Dante weep with recognition. By day, pilgrims knelt in reverence before gilded altars, their prayers rising like smoke toward heaven. By night, the same streets witnessed transactions that would make merchants of flesh wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. The papal court had become a marketplace where everything, including salvation itself, carried a price tag written in gold ducats. Rodrigo Borgia understood this world better than most. He accumulated wealth with the methodical precision of a spider spinning its web, collecting ecclesiastical benefices across Europe like a merchant hoarding precious stones. His lifestyle was that of a Renaissance prince rather than a man of God. Lavish banquets, magnificent palaces, and a succession of mistresses who bore him children with the regularity of seasonal harvests. The most significant of these relationships was with Vanna Zaccatinei, a Roman noblewoman whose beauty was matched only by her understanding of how to navigate the treacherous waters of papal politics. Between 1474 and 1482 AD, she bore Rodrigo 4 children who would become central figures in the dark drama that was about to unfold: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. Each child represented a chess piece in Rodrigo's grand game of power, their lives sacrificed on the altar of their father's overwhelming ambition. Even as a cardinal, Rodrigo's behavior scandalized Rome, no small feat in a city where scandal was as common as morning bread. Pope Pius II wrote him a scathing letter in 1460 AD, condemning conduct in Siena that had shocked the whole town and court. But shame was a luxury Rodrigo could not afford. He had a papacy to win, and moral reservations were obstacles to be overcome rather than principles to be honored. The conclave of August 1492 AD unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of corruption. Behind closed doors in the Sistine Chapel, beneath Michelangelo's future masterpiece, 23 cardinals gathered to choose the next vicar of Christ. Gold changed hands with the fluidity of water, promises were whispered like prayers, and benefices were distributed like communion wafers. When the smoke finally cleared on August 11, 1492 AD, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI, a victory achieved through what contemporaries openly acknowledged as simony, the buying and selling of holy offices. The Romans, surprisingly, celebrated. They had grown accustomed to their Spanish cardinal, and they anticipated a pontificate of magnificence and energy. Bonfires illuminated the 7 hills, torchlight processions wound through ancient streets, and triumphal arches rose like prayers made manifest in stone and wood. The new pope's coronation at St. Peter's Basilica on August 26th was greeted with what observers called the greatest ovation any pontiff had ever received. Alexander VI began his reign with measures that seemed to promise reform. He restored order to Rome's streets, where over 200 assassinations had occurred in just a few months before his election. He established districts with magistrates empowered to maintain peace, and he personally heard grievances every Tuesday, dispensing justice with what contemporary observers praised as admirable efficiency. For a brief moment it seemed that divine providence had placed the right man on the throne of St. Peter, but power, like wine, reveals character rather than creating it. Alexander's initial reforms were overshadowed by his relentless pursuit of advancement for his children, particularly his sons Juan and Cesare. Juan was made Duke of Gandia in Spain and married to a cousin of the Spanish king. Cesare, despite being only 18, was appointed to the prestigious Archbishopric of Valencia and later elevated to cardinal positions he treated as stepping stones rather than sacred callings. The papal apartments during Alexander's reign became a theatre where the sacred and profane performed an obscene ballet. Dinners stretched late into the night, accompanied by entertainment that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behaviour, even by Renaissance standards. Alexander's mistress, Julia Farnese, known throughout Rome as Julia la Bella for her extraordinary beauty, moved through the Vatican corridors as freely as any cardinal, her presence a constant reminder that the Pope's spiritual vows had been trampled underfoot by earthly desires. Johann Burchard arrived in this world of contradictions as a meticulous observer, armed with a quill and an unforgiving memory. Born around 1450 AD in Niederhaslahart, Alsace, this German priest had studied canon law and risen through ecclesiastical ranks to become the papal master of ceremonies, a position that granted him intimate access to the most secret moments of papal life. Beginning in 1483 AD, under Pope Sixtus IV, Burchard maintained what he called his Liber Notarum, a detailed diary that recorded both the magnificent ceremonies and the scandalous conduct of 5 different popes. Burchard was no romantic. He possessed the soul of an accountant and the eye of a court stenographer. His writings lack the flourishes of contemporary chroniclers, but they carry the weight of truth precisely because of their dry, matter-of-fact tone. He recorded papal ceremonies with the same attention to detail that he devoted to papal scandals, creating a documentary record that would eventually make even hardened Vatican archivists uncomfortable. The Master of Ceremonies occupied a unique position within the papal hierarchy. He was neither high enough to participate in the corruption, nor low enough to be excluded from witnessing it. Like a shadow cast by candlelight, he moved through the Vatican's most private spaces, observing everything while appearing to matter very little. Cardinals confided in him about ceremonial matters and forgot his presence during moments when discretion should have prevailed. This invisibility became his greatest asset as a chronicler of papal vice. By the late 1490s AD, the Borgia family's behaviour had begun to attract negative attention throughout Europe. Alexander's eldest son Juan had become Duke of Gandia, but his character proved as corrupt as his elevation was undeserved. Stories circulated about Juan's cruelty, his sexual excesses, and his incompetence as a military commander. The golden boy of the Borgia dynasty was becoming a liability that even his devoted father could not ignore. The events of June 14, 1497 AD changed everything. Juan's body was discovered floating in the Tiber River, his throat cut and his body bearing 9 wounds. The murder sent shockwaves through Rome and struck Alexander with grief so profound that observers wondered if divine justice had finally visited the Borgia family. For 3 days and nights, the Pope refused food and sleep, weeping behind closed doors like a broken man rather than the mighty pontiff who had once intimidated kings. In his anguish, Alexander announced a program of church reform. He called for measures to restrain the luxury of the papal court, reorganize the apostolic chancery, and suppress simony and concubinage. For a brief moment it seemed that personal tragedy might accomplish what years of criticism had failed to achieve. A commission of cardinals and canonists began drafting ordinances that anticipated the reforms of the Council of Trent, still decades in the future. But grief, like everything else in Alexander's character, proved temporary. Within months, the reform proposals were forgotten, filed away like embarrassing love letters from youth. The Pope's attention turned to his surviving children, particularly Cesare, whose iron will and ruthless ambition would now drive the family's agenda. If one had been Alexander's heart, Cesare was his sword, sharp, cold, and utterly without conscience. Cesare Borgia possessed a magnetism that drew admirers and enemies alike. Tall, handsome, and possessed of an intelligence that bordered on genius, he had initially been destined for the church like his father, but Cesare's talents lay in warfare and statecraft rather than theology. He resigned his cardinalate in 1498 AD, the first cardinal in history to voluntarily abandon the sacred office, and set his sights on secular power. The political landscape of Italy provided Cesare with opportunities that would have challenged even Machiavelli's imagination. The French King Louis XII needed papal approval for an annulment of his marriage, while various Italian duchies stood ripe for conquest by a sufficiently ruthless commander. Alexander saw in these circumstances a chance to create a kingdom for his son, even if it meant allying with foreign invaders against fellow Italians. Through a combination of siege warfare, assassination, and political manipulation, Cesare carved out a domain in central Italy that made him one of the most powerful men in Europe. His methods were so effective that Niccolò Machiavelli would later use him as the model for the prince, admiring Cesare's ability to combine cruelty with efficiency in the pursuit of political goals. But such success required resources that even papal coffers could not easily provide, leading Alexander to increasingly creative methods of fundraising. The sale of indulgences, church offices, and even cardinals' hats became systematic during Alexander's later years. Wealthy families could purchase ecclesiastical positions for their sons, effectively buying salvation along with social status. The College of Cardinals expanded not through spiritual merit, but through financial contribution, as Alexander appointed 47 new cardinals during his reign, each appointment representing thousands of ducats flowing into the papal treasury and ultimately into Cesare's war chest. Rome during this period resembled a city under occupation by its own rulers. The Borgia family treated the papal states as their personal kingdom, with Alexander as patriarch and Cesare as crown prince. Lucrezia, despite later rehabilitation of her reputation, was used as a political pawn in marriage alliances that served family interests rather than her personal happiness. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled on grounds of impotence when political circumstances changed, and she was quickly remarried to Alfonso of Biseglia, who was later murdered, possibly on Cesare's orders, when that alliance no longer served Borgia interests. The Vatican apartments during these years became a stage for increasingly elaborate entertainments that tested the boundaries of acceptable behavior, even by Renaissance standards. Alexander delighted in theatrical performances, musical concerts and dinner parties that extended deep into the night. Guests included cardinals, ambassadors, wealthy merchants, and an assortment of courtesans whose beauty was matched only by their discretion, or lack thereof. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They were demonstrations of papal wealth and power, opportunities for political negotiation, and testing grounds for loyalty among Alexander's supporters. Cardinals who participated in the Pope's entertainments were implicated in his behavior, making them reluctant to criticize or betray him. Those who refused invitations marked themselves as potential enemies, subject to the kind of retribution that had befallen so many of the Borgia's opponents. The autumn of 1501 AD found the Borgia family at the height of their power, and perhaps their corruption. Cesare had successfully completed his conquest of the Romagna, earning praise from military observers throughout Europe. Alexander had weathered various political crises, including the invasion of Charles VIII, and ongoing conflicts with rival noble families. The Jubilee year of 1500 had brought hundreds of thousands of pilgrims to Rome, filling both the papal treasury and the city's brothels with equal enthusiasm. It was in this atmosphere of triumph and moral decay that Cesare Borgia conceived what would become known as the Banquet of Chestnuts. The exact motivation for the event remains unclear. Was it celebration, political theatre, or simply the logical culmination of years of increasingly outrageous behaviour? Contemporary sources offer various explanations, but they agree on the essential facts that would shock even seasoned observers of papal vice. October 31st, 1501 AD, All Hallows' Eve, when the boundary between sacred and profane was traditionally acknowledged to be at its thinnest. The date might have been chosen deliberately, or it might have been mere coincidence that the most infamous papal orgy in history occurred on a night when ghosts were said to walk freely among the living. In either case, the symbolism was perfect. On a night dedicated to remembering the dead, the Borgia family was about to commit acts that would kill whatever remained of papal dignity. Chisitra's apartments in the Vatican occupied part of the papal palace that had been magnificently decorated by Pinturicchio during the early years of Alexander's reign. The frescoed walls depicted scenes from classical mythology and Christian history, creating an ironic backdrop for events that belonged to neither tradition. These rooms, designed to showcase the wealth and cultural sophistication of the Borgia Pope, would instead become the setting for an evening that epitomized everything critics had accused the family of representing. The guest list for the evening revealed the breadth of corruption that the Borgias had achieved. Cardinals who should have been spending the evening in prayer mixed with Roman nobles whose wealth had purchased their silence about previous papal scandals. Diplomats from various European courts attended, perhaps viewing the evening as an opportunity to gather intelligence about papal intentions, or perhaps simply drawn by curiosity about how far the Borgias would push the boundaries of acceptable behavior. But the true stars of the evening were the 50 courtesans whom Cesare had assembled for the entertainment of his guests. These were not common prostitutes pulled from Rome's streets, but sophisticated women who understood the delicate art of providing pleasure while maintaining the discretion that powerful men required. Many had previous experience at papal entertainments. They knew the rules of engagement and the rewards that awaited those who pleased their influential clients. Johann Burchard, in his capacity as master of ceremonies, was present that evening not as a participant but as an observer. His official duties required him to be available for any ceremonial functions that might arise, even during private entertainments. This professional obligation placed him in the perfect position to witness and record events that other observers might have preferred to forget. His account, written in Latin with the clinical detachment of a medical examiner, preserves details that illuminate both the specific events of that evening and the broader moral climate of Alexander's papacy. According to Burchard's meticulous record, the evening began conventionally enough with dinner served in Cesare's private chambers. The meal featured delicacies appropriate to the season and the social status of the guests, accompanied by wines from the papal cellars that had been carefully aged in Roman caves. Conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine, touching on politics, military campaigns, and artistic patronage, topics that allowed the assembled company to demonstrate their sophistication and cultural refinement. The atmosphere began to change as servants cleared away the dinner plates and the evening's true entertainment commenced. The 50 courtesans, dressed in silks and velvets that had been carefully selected to display their physical attributes to best advantage, began to dance for the assembled guests. The music, provided by musicians who had been sworn to secrecy about the evening's proceedings, created rhythms that encouraged increasingly intimate movement. What followed challenged even the broad definitions of acceptable behavior that had evolved during Alexander's papacy. As Burchard recorded with characteristic precision, the women initially danced clothed, but as the evening progressed and wine continued to flow, garments were gradually discarded until the entertainers performed completely nude. This transformation from conventional entertainment to explicit display occurred gradually enough that guests could adjust their comfort levels, but decisively enough that none could claim ignorance about the evening's ultimate direction. The centerpiece of the evening's entertainment involved the chestnuts that gave the banquet its name. Servants removed the candelabras from the dining tables and placed them on the floor around the room, creating pools of flickering light separated by areas of shadow. Chestnuts were scattered across the floor between these light sources, and the nude courtesans were instructed to crawl on hands and knees to collect them, their bodies illuminated by candlelight as they moved through the improvised obstacle course. Pope Alexander VI, according to Burchard's account, watched these proceedings from a seat of honor, accompanied by Cesare and Lucrezia. The presence of the Pope's daughter at such an event has puzzled historians for centuries. Was she a willing participant in family corruption, or a victim of circumstances beyond her control? Contemporary sources offer conflicting interpretations, but all agree that she was present as the evening reached its climax of degradation. The final phase of the entertainment involved competitions among the male guests to see who could achieve sexual relations with the greatest number of courtesans. Prizes were offered: tunics of silk, shoes, barrets, and other luxury items that represented significant value in an era when such goods were largely handmade. The competitions were conducted publicly, with servants keeping score of each participant's performance, transforming intimate human connection into a spectacle for papal amusement. Burchard's account of these events was preserved in the Vatican's secret archives, sealed away from public view for centuries. When Pope Leo XIII opened the archives to researchers in the late 19th century, he specifically expressed reluctance to allow access to documents that might damage Alexander VI's reputation. The fact that such caution was necessary more than 4 centuries after the events described suggests the enduring power of the scandal that Burchard had so carefully documented. The morning after the banquet of chestnuts found Rome unchanged on its surface, but fundamentally altered in its spiritual foundations. Pilgrims continued to arrive for masses at St. Peter's Basilica, cardinals maintained their schedules of meetings and ceremonies, and the Pope himself appeared for public audiences as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But knowledge of the previous evening's events spread through the city's network of servants, guards, and minor officials who had witnessed or heard about the papal orgy. Word of the banquet travelled beyond Rome through the diplomatic correspondence of foreign ambassadors who had either attended the event or learnt about it from reliable sources. Letters preserved in European archives document the shock and disgust of observers who had thought themselves immune to surprise about papal behaviour. Even representatives of secular rulers who maintained their own courts of considerable moral flexibility expressed amazement at what had transpired in the sacred precincts of the Vatican. The political implications of the scandal extended far beyond questions of personal morality. Reformers throughout Europe, including figures like Girolamo Savonarola in Florence, seized upon reports of the banquet as evidence that the papacy itself had become irredeemably corrupt. Calls for church councils to depose Alexander VI gained new urgency, supported by detailed accounts of behaviour that seemed to confirm the worst accusations against the Borgia Pope. Alexander's response to criticism was characteristically defiant. Rather than expressing remorse or implementing reforms, he intensified his support for Caesare's military campaigns and continued to live with the same magnificent excess that had characterized his entire papacy. If anything, the scandal seemed to liberate him from whatever restraints had previously limited his behavior, as if public acknowledgement of his corruption freed him from the necessity of maintaining even superficial respectability. The banquet of chestnuts occurred near the end of Alexander's papacy, but it was not an isolated incident of moral failure. Instead, it represented the logical culmination of years of steadily escalating corruption that had transformed the papal court into something that would have been unrecognizable to earlier generations of Christian believers. The sacred and profane had become so thoroughly intermingled that distinguishing between them required an effort that few were willing to make. Cesare Borgia's career continued to flourish in the immediate aftermath of the scandal, suggesting that moral outrage had little impact on political calculations in Renaissance Italy. His military successes continued to earn praise from observers who admired effectiveness regardless of the personal character of those who achieved it. Machiavelli's later analysis of Cesare's methods explicitly separated political skill from moral virtue, arguing that successful rulers must be willing to employ any means necessary to achieve their ends. But success built on such foundations proved temporary. Alexander VI died on August 18, 1503 AD, possibly from malaria, but surrounded by rumours of poisoning that reflected the atmosphere of suspicion and violence that had characterised his reign. His death brought immediate consequences for his children. Cesare's political support evaporated without papal protection, and he died fighting as a common mercenary in Spain just 4 years later. Lucrezia survived to become Duchess of Ferrara, but her later life was overshadowed by the scandals of her youth and the notorious reputation of her family. The new Pope, Julius II, refused to occupy the Borgia apartments where the banquet of chestnuts had taken place. He moved to rooms on the floor above, which he commissioned Raphael to decorate with frescoes that would become some of the most celebrated artworks in Vatican history. This physical relocation symbolized a broader attempt to distance the papacy from the moral failures of Alexander's reign, though the damage to papal reputation proved more difficult to repair than damaged apartments. Historical assessment of the banquet of chestnuts has varied according to the moral and political climate of subsequent eras. Catholic historians of the 19th and early 20th centuries often disputed the accuracy of Burchard's account, arguing that a reliable witness could not have documented such extreme behaviour, or that later interpolations had corrupted the original text. Protestant historians conversely embraced the scandal as evidence supporting their criticisms of papal authority and Catholic claims to moral leadership. Modern historians generally accept the basic accuracy of Burchard's account, while placing it in the broader context of Renaissance Italian culture. They note that sexual displays and public entertainments involving prostitutes were not uncommon among secular rulers of the period, making Alexander's behaviour shocking primarily because of his position as head of the Catholic Church, rather than because such conduct was unknown in contemporary society. The architectural setting of the banquet adds another layer of historical irony to the events of that October evening. The rooms where the orgy occurred had been decorated by Pinturicchio with frescoes depicting episodes from classical mythology and Christian history. Ancient gods and saints looked down from painted walls as scenes unfolded that would have scandalized both pagan and Christian sensibilities, creating a visual commentary on the distance between artistic ideals and human reality. Archaeological investigations of the Vatican apartments have revealed details about the physical layout that help explain how such events could occur within the papal palace. The Borgia apartments were designed with multiple chambers connected by corridors that allowed for both public ceremonies and private entertainments. Soundproofing between rooms meant that activities in one area might not be audible in adjacent spaces, providing the privacy necessary for Alexander's increasingly extreme behavior. The preservation of Burchard's diary in the Vatican secret archives raises questions about the Church's relationship with its own history. For centuries, these documents remained sealed, accessible only to a handful of researchers who had received special permission from papal authorities. The decision to maintain such records while restricting access to them suggests recognition of their historical importance combined with embarrassment about their contents. Contemporary accounts from sources other than Burchard provide corroborative evidence for at least some version of the events described. Diplomatic correspondence from the period includes references to papal entertainments that push the boundaries of acceptable behavior, though few sources provide the explicit details that make Burchard's account so compelling. The convergence of multiple sources pointing to similar conclusions strengthens the case for accepting the basic historicity of the Banquet of Chestnuts. The scandal's impact on subsequent papal history cannot be measured solely in terms of immediate political consequences. Alexander VI's behavior, culminating in events like the Banquet of Chestnuts, provided ammunition for Protestant reformers who argued that the papacy itself had become irredeemably corrupt. Martin Luther's criticisms of papal authority gained credibility from well-documented examples of moral failure at the highest levels of church hierarchy. The Counter-Reformation that began in the mid-16th century represented, in part, a response to scandals like the Banquet of Chestnuts. Church leaders recognized that moral reform was necessary to restore papal credibility and counter Protestant criticisms. The Council of Trent's emphasis on clerical discipline and the establishment of seminaries for priestly education addressed problems that had been dramatically illustrated by Alexander VI's conduct. But reform came at a cost that extended beyond mere policy changes. The Baroque magnificence of post-Tridentine papal ceremonies represented an attempt to restore dignity to papal authority through visual splendor and carefully choreographed ritual. The spontaneous entertainments that had characterized Alexander's court gave way to formal presentations designed to emphasize papal majesty while minimizing opportunities for scandal. The psychological impact of events like the Banquet of Chestnuts on participants and observers remains difficult to assess from historical distance. For the courtesans who performed that evening, the experience probably represented professional obligation rather than personal degradation. Their social position made such employment an economic necessity rather than a moral choice. For church officials who attended, the evening may have represented either willing participation in corruption or reluctant compliance with papal expectations that carried the threat of professional retaliation. The broader Roman population's response to knowledge of papal behavior reveals the complex relationship between religious authority and popular faith. Despite widespread awareness of Alexander's moral failures, pilgrims continued to flock to Rome, masses continued to be celebrated, and the sacramental system continued to function. This suggests that popular Catholicism had developed sufficient theological sophistication to distinguish between the personal worthiness of church officials and the validity of their religious functions. The Banquet of Chestnuts represents more than just an isolated incident of papal misconduct. It illuminates the broader transformation of Renaissance Italy from medieval Christendom to early modern European state system. Alexander VI's behavior reflected the values of secular princes who used luxury and spectacle to demonstrate power, but his position as spiritual leader of Catholic Christianity created contradictions that ultimately proved unsustainable. The evening of October 31st, 1501 AD, thus stands as a watershed moment in papal history, the point at which the tension between spiritual authority and temporal power reached a crisis that demanded resolution. The scandal forced subsequent popes to choose between worldly magnificence and moral credibility, a choice that would shape Catholic Church development for centuries to come. As we look back across more than 5 centuries at that candlelit evening in the Vatican apartments, we see reflections of humanity's eternal struggle between sacred aspirations and profane desires. The chestnuts scattered across the marble floors of papal chambers were humble fruits that became symbols of how far human dignity can fall when power escapes moral constraint. In a world where such contrasts still exist, where spiritual leaders sometimes fail their followers, where power corrupts even those called to serve higher purposes, the Banquet of Chestnuts serves as both historical scandal and enduring warning. The candles that illuminated that notorious evening have long since guttered out. The participants have crumbled to dust in Roman graves, and the very rooms where such scenes unfolded now display priceless artworks to reverent tourists. But Burchard's careful Latin prose preserves those moments when the boundary between sacred and profane collapsed entirely, when the Vicar of Christ became indistinguishable from the most dissolute Roman emperor, and when chestnuts scattered on marble floors bore witness to the distance between human ambition and divine calling. In the end, perhaps that is the true significance of Alexander VI's forbidden orgy, not as evidence of individual moral failure, but as a mirror reflecting the eternal human capacity for both transcendence and degradation. The same species that built soaring cathedrals and created sublime religious art also gathered in papal chambers to witness spectacles that challenged the very foundations of spiritual authority. The chestnuts strewn across those Vatican floors were gathered up before dawn, but the questions they represent about power, faith, and human nature continue to scatter themselves across the floors of history, waiting for each generation to decide what it will make of the legacy left by the most perverted pope who ever claimed to hold the keys to heaven